All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and talk about the Vietnam War today. All right, one of the most infamous events of the 1960s and 70s was the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Now, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam started back in the 1950s, and so we're going to talk about that. But this is a story that I think a lot of people are still wanting to know more about, wanting to understand how the United States got involved in a war that really had no way of winning. So when we talk about it, I want you to keep in mind that these are choices that people are making. Remember, history is all about understanding the choices that people make and why they make certain choices and why the United States in the 1964 decided to go full scale into Vietnam. But even before that, why in 1954 they decided to go full scale into Vietnam or start it going into Vietnam. Now, in order to understand this, you have to go back to the French. The French had colonized this area, what was known as French Indochina. And in World War II, this area was taken over by Japan. Now, after World War II, there was some discussion about freeing and allowing these colonies to take self-determination and self-autonomy and to decolonize. But the French desperately wanted to keep their colonial possessions, and the United States, wanting to keep the French happy for the growing Cold War, will give in. So the French will come in and try to reassert control over this area of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam right here. Now, a young nationalist, Ho Chi Minh, who had been at Versailles and had attempted to convince Woodrow Wilson to help free the Vietnamese people, and had worked with the United States during World War II. During World War II, Ho Chi Minh was very much a part of the U.S. War effort against Japan in Southeast Asia. Ho Chi Minh will begin a war to oust the French, and they call it the French War. Okay, so Vietnam versus France. Now, the United States will help the French, will give military aid and money, not as far as soldiers, but weapons and money to help the French. But the French will face a massive defeat at the fortress of Dien Bien Phu. And it's at that point that the French decide to sue for peace. And at Geneva, a peace is negotiated, a ceasefire is negotiated between the French and the Vietnamese. And at the 17th parallel, they decide to split Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And North Vietnam is under the control of Ho Chi Minh and his People's Army. South Vietnam was under a French-educated, American-backed, quote-unquote, president who tended to be more favorable to the United States. Now, but he was Catholic. He did not understand, and he was not really a part of the Vietnamese people because he'd spent most of his life in France. So he was really seen as an outsider by many people. Now, the United States could have walked away at that point, but in 1954, you have 8 years before, you had the fall of China to communism. You've just gotten out of the Korean War to try to stop the spread of communism from the North Korea to South Korea. And a lot of the way that Americans were thinking in 1954 was, we have to stop Vietnam from falling fully to communism, or else the whole of Southeast Asia will fall to communism. And so the United States will begin in 1954 sending military advisors to prop up the South Vietnamese regime. Now, the South Vietnamese regime does not win any love from the people of Vietnam. They're highly, they persecute Buddhists. In fact, there's a famous picture of a Buddhist monk setting himself on fire in protest of the Diem regime. And this is a problem that the United States has kind of forced upon itself, because they're thinking in Cold War terms, they're thinking in larger geopolitical terms, and they're not thinking in smaller nationalistic terms. In reality, within a year of Geneva, there was supposed to be elections that were going to unify Vietnam. But Jim knew that the South Vietnamese leader knew that if there was elections, that Ho Chi Minh would win. So he canceled the elections and refused to unify Vietnam. And it's at that point that the North Vietnamese began to attack the South Vietnamese in order to unify the country. Very similar to what we saw in the Korean War, right? Now, Ho Chi Minh is an expert at playing China and Soviet Union off of one another to get as many supplies as they can. And so both China and the Soviet Union will work to support the North Vietnamese. Now, the United States will continue to push in military advisors, money, and weapons into South Vietnam to stop North Vietnam's aggression. By 1963, the United States was upset with the leader of South Vietnam, so they allowed for the generals of the South Vietnamese army to stage a coup and assassinate him. This created instability in the South, which led to further U.S. involvement, because as the country became more unstable, the U.S. had to push more money and more troops into the country to stabilize it, to keep it from falling to the north. Then in 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is right off the coast of North Vietnam, there's an incident in which a U.S. ship reports that it has been fired upon by a northern Vietnamese ship. Does that actually happen? No. It is a jittery, radar tech who assumes that they had fired on him. But that's not what the American president, Lyndon Johnson, tells the people. He tells the people that they've been fired upon, that the U.S. has been fired upon, and he uses that as a reason to get what passed through Congress, what is known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now, the Tonkin Resolution is basically a blank check that allowed Lyndon Johnson to go in and stabilize the South and keep the North from taking over. And he's going to use this as a way of escalating the war in 1964, 65, 66, and 67. And that's what you're going to see, a massive escalation of war during this time. Okay? Now, before we get into the fighting between the United States and what they call the American War, the Vietnamese call the American War, we'll talk a little bit about Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist who had turned to communism and Soviet-style communism after being rebuked by Wilson in the West at Versailles. As he's developing his own strategy, and as him and his generals are developing their own strategy for how to defeat the French and then eventually the United States, they go back to this parable of how did the tiger kill the elephant? The elephant's bigger, stronger. How does the tiger take down an elephant? And as Ho Chi Minh put it, if the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger does not stand still. He will leap onto the back of the elephant, tearing huge chunks from his hide, and then the tiger will leap back into the dark jungle, and slowly the elephant will bleed to death. That will be the war in Indochina. So basically what Ho Chi Minh is telling everybody, and what most observers understood, is that in order to...
Mr. Bowling, I'll have a little bit of contact tracing for whoever's going to be doing it today.
Sorry.
This is Susie, by the way.
All right, hold on. Let me turn this off.
Are you the nurse? That's what they tell me.
All right, so here Ho Chi Minh is basically telling everybody that the way that they're going to defeat the French in the United States is that they're slowly going to bleed them to death, and that they're not going to lose. We've seen this for guerrilla insurgent warfare before, that the only way that a sergeant in guerrilla war can succeed is if they outlast the bigger, more powerful opponent. The United States is going to drop more bombs on North Vietnam than was dropped on the entirety of World War II. They're going to bomb and bomb and bomb. It's called Operation Rolling Thunder. It is a massive bombing campaign, and it doesn't stop them. They're going to burn down the forest, and they're going to kill the forest. They're going to spread chemicals everywhere. The United States will, and it won't stop them. They're going to do everything they can, and eventually the United States will give up because it becomes too costly. it becomes too bloody, and the United States will back out. And that's what Ho Chi Minh is betting on. All right, so going into, again, why does Johnson take us into Vietnam? There are recordings of Johnson saying there is no reason to go in there, that this is a lose-lose situation for the United States. So why go in? Well, the last Democratic president to lose a country to communism had faced irreparable political damage. Truman had, quote-unquote, lost China. And Johnson was determined not to lose Vietnam. And this all feeds into a theory that many Americans had at the time. It was called the domino theory, that if one major country falls to communism, all the smaller countries around it will also fall to communism. And so the idea is to prop up that domino, to prop up Vietnam, make sure that they don't fall to communism. Therefore, the rest of Southeast Asia won't fall to communism. So after the Gulf of Tonkin, you see the massive increase in troop deployment into South Vietnam. All right, from 65 all the way up to 200,000, all the way up to its height in 68, over 500,000. Now, when you look at the fighting happens in two waves. You have the ground war and you have the air war. The air war, as we talked about, is called Operation Rolling Thunder, in which the United States would just bomb and bomb and bomb. The problem was they were very predictable about it. The Vietnamese would tell you, we knew the U.S. Pilots wouldn't wake up early. They'd come around 9:30, and they would bomb, so we would hide while they were bombing. Then they would take a break for lunch, and we could come out and do some things during lunchtime, and then they'd come back for the afternoon, and by about 5 or 6 they were done, and we could come back out. And so the bombing campaign, while it dropped a lot of bombs on North Vietnam, it was not highly effective compared to and this is something that military strategists have seen over and over again, whether it's World War II or Vietnam or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that bombing is not as effective as we think it is. It doesn't create deaths as far as the U.S. troops are concerned, but it does create animosity against the United States. The other part of the fighting is the ground war. Now, the problem with the ground war is that the United States could not control the land. U.S. troops would go into an area, and while they were there, they could control it. But at night, they tended to want to be housed or fortified in the cities, and so they'd leave the countryside, and the Vietcong would come back out. Just so you know, there are two parts to this enemy. All right, you have the regular North Vietnamese army that was under the lead of Ho Chi Minh and his generals. Then you have the Vietcong. These are South Vietnamese citizens who were waging a rebellion, an uprising against the South Vietnamese government. So the Vietcong and the North Vietnamese are the two forces that the United States are fighting. And so the United States could not control land. They could not take over large swaths of territory in Vietnam. What they ended up doing is they would start racking up body counts. They would have someone who was officially the body counter of a regiment or a group of troops. And so whenever there was an encounter, they'd say, "Oh, the Vietnamese lost 200, we lost 10." So it was a victory. But Ho Chi Minh's already told them, "You can kill 1 million of us, and we'll kill 100,000 of you, and you'll quit first." And in the end, the Vietnamese, they lose millions of people. They lose 10% of the population, which is a massive death toll for a war. But they persevere. Okay. Now, one of the ways, that made some issues, one of the ways in which the way the Vietnamese fought, caused issues for the United States is that many times there was a guerrilla war, which means that you didn't know who the enemy was. The Vietnamese landscape and geography is very much a jungle. And so you had a lot of foliage and a lot of places to hide. And then you had friendly relations between North Vietnam and its neighbors in Cambodia and Laos. And you had them being able to use trails through neighboring countries to actually get to actually get supplies from North Vietnam down into South Vietnam to the Vietcong. It's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so this created a whole lot of issues for the United States. And what the United States ended up doing is they started dropping what's called Agent Orange. And Agent Orange was a herbicide which would kill off the trees and kill off parts of the jungle. Then you also had napalm. Napalm is liquid fire, and they would use that to burn off big parts of big chunks of foliage. And then when Nixon becomes president in 1969, he will expand the war into Cambodia, and he'll start bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail as much as he can in Cambodia, and this is going to cause a lot of reaction at home. Now, leading up to 1968, there was talk amongst the American advisors and the American generals and Lyndon Johnson that the war was going well. If you looked at the body counts, the Vietnamese were losing more people than the U.S. And by 68, by the end of 67, basically the generals and LBJ were saying that they could see the light at the end of the tunnel, that the war was almost over with, and that everything was about to be finished. And then in January of 1968, the Tet Offensive hit. Now, the Tet Offensive was a massive offensive of both North Vietnam and Vietcong, and it attacked U.S. and South Vietnamese army bases and areas throughout South Vietnam. This is going to create what is known as a credibility gap, because people back at home are sitting here going, people at home are sitting around going, hey, this is problematic because you've told us this whole time that the war is almost done, the war is almost done, the war is almost done. And then now they have this massive offensive and we can't believe you anymore. Okay. So this created some issues for the American generals who were trying to present this kind of facade of everything is going okay and everything's going okay. All right. Other issues started popping up. You have a very young and inexperienced troops that were going over from the United States to fight in Vietnam. The average age of the American soldier in Vietnam was 19, compared to the average age of the American soldier in World War II was 26. So much younger, much more immature. You also had a much more psychologically damaging war because of the issues of the guerrilla warfare and not knowing who the enemy was. And this created some really horrific events in the Vietnam War, including the My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre was when the U.S. soldiers went into the village of My Lai and just massacred everybody in there. And then it was only when a U.S. helicopter actually turned its guns on the American soldiers that they stopped killing everybody in the village. Because of Tet, because of My Lai, because of these things that are happening, LBJ is going to lose massive credibility and massive popularity. When we talk about LBJ, historians like to call him half of a great president, because when you look at his social programs, the Great Society, there's a lot of greatness there that's trying to stop poverty and create equality. But then you look on the other side at Vietnam and the way that he and his generals execute this war and why they go to war creates anger and distrust. And this is something that we are still feeling today. When you hear people talk about how corrupt and terrible the government is, a lot of that stems from Vietnam and what's going to happen right after Vietnam, which is Watergate, which creates a massive distrust of the government. LBJ will hear it out his window all throughout 68. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And this created so much sadness and mourning for LBJ that he will drop out of the presidential race. He will not seek re-election in 1968. In 69, Richard Nixon becomes president. He will expand bombing into Cambodia to try to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He will also propose what's called Vietnamization. Basically, start handing over most of the fighting and most of the military effort to the South Vietnamese. And this is just a way of saying we're not going to fight anymore. We need to start pulling troops out. And we need to get out of this war as fast as possible. So Vietnamization is going to lead to the United States eventually negotiating a ceasefire with the North Vietnamese. with North Vietnamese, and then the United States will pull their troops and their people out in 1973-74. Okay. As soon as the U.S. is out, of South Vietnam, the war begins again between South Vietnam and North Vietnam. This time, the United States does not intervene. The United States allows whatever has happened to happen, and in the end, South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam to unify the country under the communist North regime. Okay, here's the fall of Saigon. All right, now Vietnam is known not just for its military issues and this feeling like the first real war that the United States had lost. It's also known for its political and social issues at home, because the United States will become a catalyst for massive political activism and demonstrations for peace amongst American youth in 1960s. You can see the protest at the Pentagon here. You can see the protests at Columbia University. You're going to have anti-war demonstrations on college campuses all throughout the United States. In a demonstration against Richard Nixon and the administration after the bombing of Cambodia. At Kent State, there will be the U.S. National Guard will open fire on the students, killing 4 students. A week later, you have a similar incident at Jackson State in which 2 are shot. So you have this kind of roiling tension at home as the American youth really become anti-war and begin protesting and demonstrating against the war. John Kerry, who had been part of the war, had gone and fought in the war, will go in front of Congress and ask, how do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? And this is profound and powerful, and it leads to a lot of questioning of the Army, the military-industrial complex, the Vietnam War, the American government. There's a lot of cynicism and distrust that occurs. Now, I won't play the songs for you, but you can go through on this presentation and play the songs. But the 1960s is known for its radical music and the rock and roll, and a lot of that is centered on anti-Vietnam War. So I'll let you go and you can check that out. Now, even though there was a rising anti-war movement, there's still quite a few. Most of the Americans probably were okay with the war, or at least were neutral with it. Even amongst the youth, even amongst the college kids, you had the pro-war movement. These are called the Young Americans for Freedom, and they will eventually help create the conservative wave of the 1980s. All right, so the war ends in 1973. So what happens because of it? Well, the Great Society is underfunded, so the war on poverty is lost. Massive amounts of spending and deficit spending on the United States, because this will be the first war that the U.S. does not ask its citizens to pay for, through war bonds and things of that nature. Morale and self-confidence and trust in the government is gone. Right after World War II, there was so much trust and love for the government, and that created, the societies of 1950s and 60s. By the 70s, people did not trust the government anymore because of its failure in Vietnam. A new amendment would pass, is the 26th Amendment, which allowed 18-year-olds to vote because they had been asked to fight, but they didn't have the right to vote, so this gives them the right to vote. The draft will be abolished so that you have an all-volunteer army. The Congress will attempt to take some powers back, called the War Powers Act, but it is relatively ineffective in stopping U.S. presidents from going to war. And then, of course, there is the constant questioning of veterans, and this will create almost a cultural war over veterans and how to treat veterans. All right, so I'm going to end there.